This lecture is in two parts. The first part is a very elevating, inspiring story about the march of democracy around the world. The second part is a somewhat concerning story about the erosion and slippage of democracy in the world, and it's really got two time periods. The first time period involves the inception of what Samuel Huntington has called the third wave of global democratization. And I'll begin by explaining his concept of waves, and then I'll show you kind of, a quick march through history and pictures to try and identify some of the highlights of this extraordinary and really unprecedented period in world history. And then we'll look at the democratic recession, which I think I'll be able to persuade you through some very simple figures and statistical tracking. We can probably date to, as an inception point, around 2006. You're going to see that there's a kind of inflection point there, a break in the graph in terms of democratic progress. So first, what is this metaphor of waves of democratization? If you've had a chance to read Samuel Huntington's book yet, or the piece of it for today, from the third wave, global democratization in the late 20th century, you know that his conception is very simple. It's mechanical. It's really mathematical. A wave, in this sense, is a period in world history where there are significantly more transitions to democracy than transitions away from democracy. And he kind of goes through a very awkward historical reconstruction here to suggest that there was a very long first wave that began with the kind of deeper enlargement of the popular suffrage and therefore expansion of democratization in the United States in 1828 with the election of the first American populist, who's very popular with the current American populist president, Andrew Jackson, and then the gradual rise of democracy in Western Europe and Latin America. But keep in mind, this is a very relaxed standard, both in terms of democracy, because the majority of people couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, Native Americans couldn't vote, African Americans couldn't vote. It was very limited franchise here, and through most of this period in Latin America and in Western Europe as well. And he's really relaxing the concept of wave to have a nearly century-long trend that's just kind of incrementally accumulating things. But to make his theory work, he had to do this historical reconstruction. In any case, what we do get is a very rapid reverse wave, okay? So this is what he calls that other period, when there are significantly more transitions away from democracy, or what we call in this course breakdowns of democracy, than there are transitions to democracy. And I think, I hope you know this history about the rise of fascism and how it was rooted in the Great Depression and the stresses of that had some of their roots in the end of World War I. I do want to say just kind of a note, I highly recommend, if you get a chance at some point, to read Madeleine Albright's really remarkable, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, her remarkable book, which was recently published, Fascism, A Warning. It's a little bit loose in the scope in that it talks about a lot of forms of authoritarianism, not all of them being fascist in the strict sense. But in terms of tracing the rise of this with Mussolini and then Hitler, and kind of some of the nature of the relationship between a fascist leader and a kind of blind following, it's got a lot of interesting insights and historical illustrations. In any case, this was obviously a very dark time for democracy. The world had been in the previous century gradually accumulating more democracies, and gradually seeing a deepening and expansion of democratic rights and processes in the places where formal democratic institutions had come into being. And then, it just, it nearly all imploded. Huntington's count in his book is different than in The Spirit of Democracy because he's looking only at countries over 1 million population. But by that count, he judges that the number of democracies in the world fell to, under a dozen at the nadir of this first reverse wave. And of course, fascism was defeated in World War II. And then we had a second wave emerging out of the ashes of that with remarkable success stories in Germany and Japan, renewal of democratic momentum in Latin America, and now kind of expanding to fuller democracy in some of those countries, decolonization, particularly in the British Empire, leading to the birth of a large number of democracies, both among the Pacific and Caribbean island states, India and Sri Lanka, and then later parts of Africa. By his count, the number of democracies peaked at 51 during this period from the end of World War II. Of course, World War II ended in 45, but his waves kind of overlap a little bit in time. The beginning of a wave or a reverse wave may overlap with the end of another by a year or two, by his logic. And of course, the birth of the largest democracy in the world, India, with its independence in 1947, the creation of Ghana, and a lot of other post-colonial regimes in sub-Saharan Africa that inherited formally democratic institutions, but in almost every case quickly gave way either to one-party rule, one-man rule, or military rule. And those are the three principal options to democracy in the world still to this day. The second reverse wave saw a large number of military coups in Latin America and in East and Southeast Asia. And I want you to bear this in mind because the way democracy fell very often at the end of the second wave is quite different than the way it's been yielding in the third wave. We see very few military coups now as the means by which democracy dies. There's a very different formula that I'm going to be introducing in this lecture. In any case, one of the paradigmatic early ones was in Brazil in 1964, and there followed a wave of other coups. Probably the most famous one that you've heard about is the Chilean military coup in September of 1973, in which the United States, I am ashamed to say, had some significant complicity by encouraging and by some accounts, even really stimulating the Chilean generals to end the socialist experiment of Salvador Allende in Chile in a situation of very, very deep polarization. I'm not going to dwell right now on the process and causes of democratic failure during this period, because we're going to talk about it a lot later in the course when we look at democratic breakdowns and why democracies break down. I will only say now that almost everywhere that this happened, you had an abundance of political polarization and very substantial weakness, partly as a result of political polarization, of commitment to the norms and values of democracy that we're going to be talking about soon in the class. And then really in many of these cases, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and relatively lower income countries in parts of Latin America and certainly in Asia, all of the facilitating and encouraging factors for democratic development were either missing or not very substantial. So most of the cases where democracy broke down in this period, we wouldn't identify as cases that had very ripe conditions for democratic stability. And yet if you take a very deterministic view and say, well, they were bound to fail because they didn't have the facilitating conditions, then how do you explain the fact that India, Sri Lanka, Jamaica, Costa Rica, and some other lower income countries, Botswana as the most successful example in sub-Saharan Africa, did survive? So it's important not to be too deterministic here. This is the worst of the worst in some ways, Augusto Pinochet, who had a lot of blood on his hands during the coup. And in its aftermath, you had the United States embracing as well, in the decade before, the South Korean military dictator Park Chung-hee, who seized power in 1961. You see a succession, I'm sorry to say, of American presidents kind of putting their arms around these dictators. On the left, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. On the right, not ideologically, they were both kind of on the right ideologically. I'm just saying in terms of the slide, the Shah of Iran is on the right here. And of course, when we get into democracy promotion and American foreign policy, you will see that the presidency of Richard Nixon was really, it was the nadir for American democracy, at least until recently. And it was also the nadir in terms, the real low point in terms of American commitment to promoting democratic values, ideals, norms, institutions, civil society. It's not that before Richard Nixon we wrapped ourselves in glory in this regard. It's not that we weren't embracing, encouraging, working with lots of authoritarian regimes around the world before then. But particularly, you can go back to Woodrow Wilson, and some elements of FDR, John F. Kennedy. There were some kind of more idealistic streaks in American foreign policy in terms of democracy and human rights, and those kind of evaporated during this period. We'll talk much more about that later. And that kind of goes on through the Nixon presidency, which, as you know, ended with Richard Nixon's resignation in the Watergate scandal in August of 1974. Now, here's what's interesting, and I would like you to bear this in mind as you walk out of this classroom and just think about where we're at in our current moment in the United States and going forward possibly for some time. The inception of a change in American foreign policy, which would become very dramatic when Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States in November of 1976, and then introduced a human rights emphasis, not yet a democracy emphasis, but a human rights emphasis in American foreign policy, and created the office, which has undergone a name change and an expansion of mandate, but remains an extremely important institution inside the State Department, called the Office of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, now the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. The inception of all this was not with the change in the executive branch. It was with pressure from the Congress. And so by 1973, 1974, you had the emergence of a cadre of, maybe I should use that word, of a coalition of members of Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, some senators as well, who were reacting against American involvement in the Vietnam War, but also saying, hey, why are we supporting all these dictators? We should be pressuring them to at least improve their human rights record. And they were starting to press for cutting off military assistance to some of these dictatorships, and imposing economic sanctions as well.